Welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast, dedicated to the Holy Family. I'm Thomas V. Miras. Today I'm talking to Corey Olsen, aka the Tolkien Professor, about his online master's program in imaginative literature, Signum University. Hey everyone, just a couple of quick announcements at the top of today's show. First of all, the podcast is now available on iHeartRadio, so if you use that, you can subscribe there. And secondly, CatholicCulture.org now has an email newsletter that you can subscribe to specifically for receiving announcements about each episode of the podcast and announcements related to the podcast in general. Now, of course, the best way to get the podcast is just to subscribe directly on whatever podcasting service you use. But maybe if you know someone who's not tech savvy and doesn't understand how podcasts work or how to subscribe to them, this would be easier, that they would just get an email, they can click the link and listen to the podcast right on the web page. So anyway, you can subscribe to the podcast announcement email by going to catholicculture.org/newsletters and just pick that one as the one you want to subscribe to and fill in your info. My guest today has the honor and distinction of being the first non-Catholic to be interviewed on the Catholic Culture Podcast. He is a Christian, though, but his work is very much of interest to Catholics because he is a Tolkien scholar. The man of whom I speak is Corey Olsen, better known as the Tolkien Professor. He is the host of the popular Tolkien Professor podcast, which has been going on for several years now, and in the past few years, he has started an online master's degree program called Signum University, which has just completed a very important step towards accreditation. So in today's episode, we talk about Signum University and the phenomenon of online education and its potential. And Corey also has some interesting things to say about the differences between Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. Now, at the end of this interview, I did throw a lot of questions at Corey about Tolkien's fiction, particularly The Lord of the Rings, but that section of the interview ended up being so long that I'm making it into its own separate episode. So that will be next week. You'll have a quite in-depth discussion of Middle-earth to enjoy. Corey Olsen, welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast.
Thanks very much for having me.
So you just were approved by the, what is it called? The New Hampshire...
It was the Higher Education Commission of the state of New Hampshire. That's right.
Yes.
Right.
So this is your online educational institution, Signum University, which provides master's degrees in the study of speculative literature. Now, I'm sort of interested in just the scope of that, because obviously most pre-modern literature could be characterized as speculative literature. So is it really that broad?
Well, basically the speculative literature, imaginative literature, one of the sort of things that we were searching for at the beginning was a category, right? A label that will embrace both science fiction and fantasy, both of which have been very, very much sort of at the center of what we've been interested in doing. But, and it's interesting, actually, those two disciplines, which often, sort of feel like they have a lot in common, but then sometimes don't feel like they have very much in common at all. But, both concepts, imaginative literature, speculative literature, work. Both of them, ultimately, it's about like literature that asks, what if questions, essentially. World building that is premised to quote Tolkien here, that is enabled to be the lover of nature and not her slave, that is thinking about the world and imagining things into the world without just adhering to the rules blindly of the way that our world works. We don't have ourselves really rigid definitions of what we mean by it. We would certainly include many other works of literature that would normally be claimed sort of by traditional literature programs as well within the bounds of imaginative literature. Our goal is not to exclude, but to include by the usage of those terms.
Right. Hence your study of classical languages and medieval literature and things like that.
Exactly. Yes. No, so I was just going to say that's something that kind of grew up essentially out of the interests of our students. So many of our people were interested in studying philology, the history of language. Largely, of course, it's mostly Tolkien's fault. Many of our students are Tolkien fans. And of course, with Tolkien's interest in this area, he has sort of talked many of our students into, wanting to learn more about Germanic philology and how language works. So we developed a course of studies in that, mostly out of student demand, essentially.
Right. Would you say Tolkien is sort of at the center of this program?
Yes, definitely. It's not that it is designed or has been designed to be just a Tolkien studies program by any means, and that we want to unduly privilege it. But yeah, I mean, our student body essentially grew initially and still really often is drawn from the audience of my podcast, my Tolkien Professor podcast.
Right.
So there is certainly a dominant interest in Tolkien, not an exclusive interest, but a dominant interest in Tolkien among a lot of our students. So yeah, we certainly focus on that.
Is there anybody else who rivals him there? I mean, is Lewis up there as well, or is he just with the rest of the riffraff?
Well, Lewis is definitely an interest. I don't know that Lewis necessarily stands head and shoulders as a second spot. Probably, really, the Harry Potter series is also a fairly serious minor field of interest for a lot of our people, actually. But there is definitely a lot of interest in Lewis. It's the relationship between Lewis studies and Tolkien studies is really interesting, right? On the one hand, they go hand in hand, and everybody sort of knows that. There's this sort of natural interest in Lewis or Tolkien that comes as a package deal, right? With interest in the other one. And yet the two of them are so different that very often, people who, are great lovers of Lewis, are great lovers of Tolkien, don't just have a hard time getting into the other. So it's kind of I won't say love-hate relationship, because that's far too strong, but there's a sort of a complex relationship in some ways. So that's not to say that there's an active bias against Lewis in many of our students, but a love of Lewis is certainly not automatic as an accompaniment to Tolkien fandom, certainly.
Well, my personal opinion, I like Lewis, but I wouldn't put him up there with Tolkien as a fiction writer.
Right. As a fiction writer, no. Though again, it's so I find it so hard to directly compare them. I teach. I love Lewis. Absolutely love Lewis. But I love Lewis at least as much for his nonfiction as for his fiction. It's if I only had Lewis's fiction, if all I had was Chronicles of Narnia and like the Space Trilogy. Okay, if I had the Chronicles of Narnia and the Space Trilogy, I would definitely, consider Lewis among the sort of interesting, but certainly well below Tolkien. Till We Have Faces, however, is by far the most brilliant piece of fiction Lewis ever wrote. And
I've heard many people say that, yeah.
Up with, really, up with anything that Tolkien wrote. And that is very, very high praise. I mean, it's still different, but my goodness, it is just incredible. So Lewis did write one incredible luminous work of fiction, and that is Till We Have Faces. But anyway, obviously I wouldn't give the Chronicles of Narnia up if I were asked to. So, and I do love Lewis. My own kind of complicated relationship between the two of them is that, I have loved Tolkien ever since I was a child, but Lewis is like my best friend. I don't know. It's almost like the difference between your best friend and your wife. Like Tolkien.
Or which is which?
Tolkien is my wife, and Lewis is my best friend. Lewis is the person who he thinks and talks like me. Like when I listen to Lewis talk, I am like hearing someone who speaks right on my wavelength, and he addresses me right where I am. And whereas with Tolkien, I love it, but I love it in part because it's strange. Tolkien does not think like me, and I would never think and write like he does. And I find myself in sort of awe of the things that Tolkien does, and I love to sort of contemplate it and appreciate it. And obviously I've been doing that quite a lot for a long time now. But yeah, it's just they're so different. They're so different.
Yeah, and that goes, what you said there goes right along with what Lewis says about friendship and the four loves, in terms of when you're friendship, you're looking more at the same thing than you are looking at each other.
Exactly. Absolutely. Yeah. I sort of, metaphorically speaking, not thinking of the actual tweed-coated Don himself, but yes, I gaze lovingly into Tolkien's face, right? Whereas Lewis and I sit shoulder to shoulder working on the same project. Absolutely.
Does that have anything to do with confession to you, or is it just a matter of personality?
Well, I mean, I mostly personality. I don't think the difference in the confessions of Lewis and Tolkien make that much of a difference to me. I'm sure it does influence me, but I think probably it's a little bit more indirect than that. At the end of the day, the number one thing is, I'll sort of give a spoiler of my overall conclusion that I drew at the end of I've taught now twice a Lewis and Tolkien course at Signum, and the goal of that course was not just like, hey, let's do a survey of like some of Tolkien's works and some of Lewis's works, but instead I was trying to look at when the two of them are doing very similar kinds of projects, like when they're both undertaking a similar kind of imaginative thing, right? So like, for instance, I looked at The Hobbit and I looked at The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe as two moments when the two of them are essentially telling a fairy tale, something which is in the general genre of, someone from our world wanders into a fairy tale and the adventures that he has there. The Hobbit, of course, isn't that in its frame. It doesn't involve, any humans from our world going into fairy, but it kind of does. Bilbo is kind of that, right? He's not exactly, but it's very much the sort of spirit of The Hobbit in a lot of ways. Anyway, so that's just kind of an illustration of one of the things that I did in that class. And in the end, my conclusion there, talking about Lewis and Tolkien, is that I would say, in essence, like at his heart of hearts, Tolkien is a poet. At his heart of hearts, Lewis is a teacher, and neither one of them can turn it off. And it is what they both are willing to sacrifice everything else for. Tolkien will sacrifice the teaching points, right? He will sacrifice, not that he will sacrifice the substance of doctrine, but he will sacrifice the conveying of doctrine, right? He will risk being completely misunderstood and people coming away with a completely wrong impression from his books, as many people have done, I would argue, because of the thing that he's trying to capture, right? Because of the thing that he's trying to express and to convey, this sort of higher thing that he is discovering and unfolding. And if, whether or not people understand it, whether they draw the correct conclusions from it, that's not his primary concern. With Lewis is a teacher and he can't help himself. He is, it's not that his works are merely pedantic or something like that. It's not that they're purely pedagogical in their intention from one end to the other. They are sort of driven by an artistic vision. I'm not trying to suggest that they're not. But again, at the end of the day, if he has to choose between, sort of achieving the artistic vision and conveying his points clearly and accurately, he does the latter, right? And that is ultimately, for me, what the difference is. I'm not a poet. I am a teacher, and I am not a poet. And I have the same, many of the same kinds of strengths and weaknesses that Lewis does, and very few of the same strengths and weaknesses that Tolkien does. So to me, that's what it kind of comes down to. I love poetry, but I've never successfully written a poem in my life. As Sam Gamgee might say, a few comic rhymes every now and again, but not what you call real poetry,
Exactly.
So yeah, but I love it. I admire it, and in part admire it because I can't do it. But
right.
Anyway, in the end, I think now, do I think that their different confessions influences that? Yes, I do. I mean, I certainly, the way in which Tolkien was very hesitant about Lewis's program of doctrinal works, the way that I know that, Tolkien was always uncomfortable with that because Lewis was not a priest. He's like, who are you? Like, why are you doing this? And I have to admit that I am 100% in sympathy with Lewis's motivations, and thoughts about why he did that, and I know in the same position, at least I like to think I would do the same thing. And that in part I know is informed by the fact that, had I been raised in the, pre-Vatican II Catholic environment that Tolkien had, maybe my reactions to that might be sort of conditioned a little differently. So in some of those ways, I do think that the confession matters, but it's not in the sense of it's kind of in that way, in the sense, in like a culture sense, rather than in a sort of disagreement on any sort of particular doctrinal point or anything like that kind of sense.
That's really interesting. By the way, having listened to hundreds of hours of your content, it's really fun to just be actually speaking to you now.
Yeah. Well, it's always fun to get a chance to meet people, and I know I also have had, as an audiophile myself who listens to I don't even know how many hours per day of audiobooks and other broadcasts and things. I too have had the experience of speaking to somebody that I'm used to hearing, on my earbuds, and I know it can be a little bit surreal, but I always enjoy getting a chance to talk to folks and to speak also to the listeners in your podcast as well.
So how long has Signum been going on for now?
I originally started Signum. We offered our very first class in the fall of 2011. We are now exactly 7 years old. And this is a really long project. One of the strange things that I can see in people often when I tell them the news, if I, let people know, hey, well, we've received program approval from the state of New Hampshire, from the Department of Education. This is really exciting. I can see a lot of people say, oh, yes, that's really great. But in their eyes, I can read like, wait a second, you're just doing that now? Like, isn't that kind of something you've been operating for 7 years and you're only just now getting approved? How does that work? And it is.
Don't wait to ask for permission from the state.
Yeah, it is a little bit strange in some ways, but the way that these things work, and again, this is just a lot of people don't really kind of know how the system works, but basically program approval and accreditation as well, both of those processes are not something that you get in advance to get permission to start. In order to apply for them, you have to not only have basically, it is to review a program in existence, both of those processes, review programs in existence. They don't review projections or ideas. You don't come to them with a plan and say, I want to do a university like this. Will you accredit it? What they do is they look at a program that exists and say, yes, this currently existing and operating program meets our standards. And by the way, part of those standards involve, in the course of answering their questions and in the published standards and everything, are questions about our alumni, for instance, right? So it is implicit in the entire process that we will not only exist, but that we will have a program in operation and even be graduating graduates prior to that process. It's just sort of the way that it works. And on the one hand, it makes some sense. It's good to, it's good to indicate that, or rather than there's many a slip, right? Betwixt cup and lip. If you say, this is our plan, would you accredit that? They'd have to watch you like a hawk to make sure you actually did all the things that you had said you were going to do and that you were planning on doing. And that's
actually more work for them as well.
Yeah, exactly. So, it's the idea of them doing an assessment on an existing program in its way is perfectly sensible, but it does put us as a program starting up absolutely from scratch. That first class I ran off my laptop from my closet, the storage closet in my house. There was one other person who helped me build the websites and, helped me with some of the other online tech. And that was it. I was the entire faculty and staff of the university. Well, no, I shouldn't say faculty. I had two other faculty who were working with me even from that very first class. And not to mention the guest faculty and everything. But anyway, point is, it started up from this tiny startup operation with a very few people and absolutely no money. And to start from that basis and build a program to the point where it meets the standards that are going to be demanded in order to get program approval from the state and for accreditation, it requires an enormous amount. You have to have a lot of systems in place. And so we had to grow ourselves semester by semester and year by year, relying on a great deal of volunteer labor that we have had over the years. And of course, the patience and the generosity and the courage, not to mention, of our students, of our sort of early adopter, first generation students who jumped right into the program and have been studying with us all along. That's without them, it never could have happened. But yeah, that's why it's taken 7 years to get to what everybody, in some sense, both inside the system and without, sort of look at as the starting line. Essentially, it's been this long, hard journey to the starting line that we've been that we've been going through. But we are nearing the finish line. We are going to be starting the process of applying for accreditation. Of course, needless to say, I am not promising that we are going to succeed there. We have not achieved accreditation yet, but it's always been in our plans to go through that process, and we are beginning that process. We now qualify to begin that process, having achieved the program approval from the state. That's
I thought this was accreditation.
No, it's not. It's not. That's a separate thing, actually, because the accreditation is not run by any governments. Accrediting bodies are private companies, all of them. And there is an approval process. The Department of Education does an approval process on the accrediting bodies, but they're all private organizations. So that's a separate thing, but you are required to have state approval prior to applying for accreditation. So we now qualify to apply for accreditation, and so that's what we're doing. So we have we're almost there, or you could also say we're halfway there, right? Having gone through this first process, and the state process is a very rigorous process. It was a very rigorous, comprehensive review that we underwent, and it is a very similar process, not identical, but very similar process that we will be going through with the accrediting body over the course of this next year. But
congratulations on this big step towards that.
It is exciting to get there. It's exciting just to have. In fact, it's quite surreal, honestly. When you build towards something for so long, especially since it's one thing when you're undergoing a long process, to which there's an end, right? Like there are times, of course, during your childhood when your high school graduation seemed like an infinite distance away, right? And then when you finally come, it feels a little bit surreal. But the difference is that you will have been able to see coming, regularly and steadily as the years go by. And so reality kind of dawns on you step by step as you get closer. The state certification process, the program review process that we underwent was kind of came upon us like a thief in the night, almost. It was, a series of meetings I had with folks up in Concord, led us to sort of begin the process before we had been really thinking of it, which was great. So, we were able to, it was able to happen much faster than I thought it would. I've been very, very grateful for the help and support of the folks up at the Department of Education in Concord here in New Hampshire. They've been really wonderful and encouraging, as well as really, really tough and really fair. I've been very pleased by the balance there. There was never the sense either that they're just being like hostile and trying to keep us out, certainly, but nor was there the sense that we were just being waved through either. I mean, they were very rigorous. But yeah, things accelerated suddenly, and so I found myself in a position where all of a sudden we're there, right? I mean, it felt like, again, going back to my high school graduation metaphor, it felt sort of like, October of your junior year of high school, somebody pulled you out of the middle of class and ushered you onto the stage for graduation is kind of what it has felt like, So, okay, here we are. I guess we're there. But it's been great fun.
So can you take me back, let's say an overall outline of how you got from being a college professor and your motivations for moving into podcasting and getting your stuff outside of academia, going from there to where we are today?
Sure. Well, yeah, it was a very organic process. I mean, I was one of the most surprised to discover that I had founded a university. So it began when I was an untenured faculty member, and I was, working on publication like you do, and publication had never been my primary focus. And one of the reasons for this, I was kind of doing some soul searching at one point, and I was wondering, everyone was like, okay, you really need to publish more. You're coming up for tenure in a few years. You need to get some things out there. And on the one hand, I'd always liked writing. I actually never found writing things for publication hard. And so I was just sitting there, I'm like, why don't I want to do this? Why don't I like this? And my answer was because and this is going to sound harsher than I really mean, it sounded pointless, or at least the return was very low. I mean, yes, okay, the return of like getting tenure was a good one, but apart from that, like the actual work itself, the knowledge that I was going to put all of this work into writing this stuff, and at the end of the day, it was going to be read by what? How many people? a handful, a few dozen, maybe, people would ever read this. And so, I had one of those moments where I was like, I had a little, sort of identity crisis. Like, what am I doing? Like, what is the point of me? Like, what? And I had always felt my teaching to be very fulfilling. I love teaching. I love being in the classroom. I loved engaging with my students. That felt really rewarding. And so, having sort of figured out what, like, I did not feel the same sort of reward, the same satisfaction in writing for scholarly journals as I did for teaching. So, and then, of course, this is exacerbated by the fact that I was writing at the time on Tolkien. I had already kind of taken a little bit of a turn. I was writing on some medieval stuff too. I published on Sir Thomas Malory, actually, which I'm teaching on right now online. And I was working on a Chaucer thing. So I was doing some medieval stuff as well. But I was already planning that Tolkien was really what I wanted to spend more of my time with. And as I said, the kind of irony of writing on Tolkien, when I knew there were like thousands, I'm like, there must be hundreds of people out there who would be interested to like read and talk about Tolkien. And here I am like publishing it in a journal, which is like burying it, like which places from which people are actually excluded. Like they can't read it because it's way too expensive for your average person just to buy, even if they have heard of it. And it's generally just going to be held in research libraries to which a lot of people won't be able to get access. So that seemed a little bit silly given that I was writing about something that seemed really popular. So this is ultimately what led me to the idea of doing something more public, of kind of going outside the normal publishing routine and doing something a little bit different. And I decided on podcasts, not because actually I wasn't really much of a podcast follower myself at the time. It was just that because I love teaching, I could have just written a blog. That was the other option, was just to start a blog, which I thought about. But at the end of the day, I love audio stuff myself, and I love teaching. I love lecturing, and so I really wanted that opportunity to engage with my voice as well as just with my words. So that's why I decided on a podcast at that point. And of course, I found out relatively quickly that I'd been wrong. There were not hundreds of people. There were tens of thousands of people out there who were really interested to talk about this. And the way that things grew from there was simply not just the magnitude, but the quality of the response that I kept getting. I don't mean quality in the sense of good or bad. I mean the nature of it. It's not just that lots of people were listening. It's not just that people were enjoying it, in a kind of a fan way. There was a hunger in the responses that I was hearing from people. The note that was struck again and again and again in emails that I heard from people and social media comments I got from people was, I am so glad there is finally a place like people had obviously been kind of starving for a real intellectual engagement with Tolkien. And this was sort of in two ways. One, because, of course, most of the people that were responding were people who'd been out of college for a long time and many of them working jobs that they didn't necessarily really enjoy or find hugely intellectually stimulating. So the idea that there was something, that there was suddenly this podcast out there on their favorite book, which, provided this sort of intellectual stimulation that they'd been wishing for a long time, was something that they were responding to really, really passionately. At the same time, there are also many others, whether old or younger, who never had the opportunity to study Tolkien from an academic perspective at all, whose colleges, whose English departments had not taken Tolkien seriously and wouldn't offer any Tolkien classes. And so, so there were a lot of people who are even, who are recent or even current English majors or graduates who were also very passionate about this outlet, this opportunity, to talk about things. And that's where things kind of grew. As time went on, I was doing my podcast. I kept getting more and more and more, requests for like people were wanting more and more interactive stuff, more and more, clamoring for real classes, right? So I began to sort of experiment in different ways. That's when I started broadcasting recordings of the classes that I was doing college at the time where I was teaching. And that's when I started up the Silmarillion seminar as a sort of a pilot, like, hey, what if we did something that's more like a classroom structure discussion? And it's really that, by the way, it's really the Silmarillion seminar that changed my life. because that was pretty whimsical. Doing it, that is. I didn't really plan it. It was just, again, it was like hey, let me experiment with another way of doing something interactive with the listeners. I had never taught anything online before. This was 2010. It was not, back in 2010, there was some online education out there, but it was mostly just of like there was like the University of Phoenix at that point, and there was very little else. Most of online education was simply just like the very static, very asynchronous, very like using the internet to disseminate materials, essentially. But anyway, so I'd certainly never done any online teaching before, and I went into it completely skeptical. I was like, well, okay, I know the internet works well as a way to get content out there. I wasn't very sanguine about how the class discussion was going. My assumption, honestly, when I began it, was that the thing was fairly quickly going to devolve into me doing a lecture with some Q&A. Essentially, I'm like, okay, well, this isn't going to be like a real classroom discussion or anything like that. How could that work, right? We're not all in the same room together. And oh my goodness, it was incredible. The Silmarillion seminar remains one of the greatest classes I have ever taught. And I don't just mean, I'm not saying like I was more brilliant then than I've ever been. That's not what I mean. I mean like the chemistry of that group, they still have reunions. There's still this sort of special. I still will see them sometimes at conferences. Some of the participants in the Silmarillion seminar, and we all share this kind of bond from having done that. It was a life-changing experience for more than me. And anyway, that was the moment when I was like, holy cow, this works. So when I did the Silmarillion seminar, I now had two motivations. There was just the Tolkien Professor part of me, which was saying, hey, that was awesome. Let's do more of that. This is a mechanism I'd really love to use in order to, kind of take my, teaching / scholarship thing that I was doing, in a new and to me really exciting direction. But now all of a sudden, this other part of me was awake. And because as I was looking at this, I was like, holy cow, this is incredible. You can do online education. Wow, you can do a real class. You can make real classroom discussions available to people anywhere. We had people on 3 continents in those calls sometimes in the Silmarillion seminar. And, and many people who were living like way out in the boondocks and not anywhere near a university. And I'm like, this is the opportunity that this could be. Could be a life changer for many. Why don't? And so I started looking around. I'm like, surely people, now that this kind of technology is available, and it was really simple, just web conferencing technology, which we still use today. I'm like, now that we can do this, surely universities out there are going to be starting to do this, right? Because this is fantastic, and nobody was. I'm looking around and nobody's doing it. Everyone is still doing the old, stale, asynchronous online education thing, which is essentially, traditional online education is essentially the 19th century correspondence course, made more efficient by use of the internet. Instead of putting your essays in the mail and sending them off, you're sending them by email, right? So you can communicate faster with your teachers, but at the end of the day, you're having the same experience, right? And like you can watch videos, right, that your teachers post for you. But like they used to do that in the 80s, you'd get videotapes in the mail from teachers, so like that kind of correspondence course has been around for a long time. It's a wonderful tool for independent learners, but it's not for everybody, and there are a lot of people who really really will blossom in a classroom environment, where you're really interacting with the teacher and with other students. So I'm like, okay, nobody's doing this, and what's more, I began immediately to see this was also, again, 2010 to 2011. The student debt crisis was something people were starting to talk about more and more. And I will tell you, this is something that had been breaking my heart already for years. I was teaching at a small private college, very expensive, and I was an English professor, right? So I'm here talking to my senior English majors, knowing that my English majors are going off into the world, with a BA in English and $80,000 worth of debt, $100,000 worth of debt. And it's heartbreaking to see, like, knowing how the world is going to be stacked against these awesome people, and feeling like I was a part of that system, even though there was nothing I could do about it, but it was hard not to feel a little bit of culpability for it. And again, that was the other thing that I saw. I was like, okay, hey, not only is this kind of online education exciting in the sense of like, providing learning opportunities of a quality which are unprecedented in distance education. In addition, it's cheaper. You can do it cheaper because you reduce all the overhead. You don't have to have a campus. Who needs a campus? If we just did classes this way without paying the massive, not only just the money you've got to raise to construct your buildings and buy your real estate to begin with, but of course then the millions and millions of dollars every year you have to spend maintaining your campus and your structures. If you could just get rid of all that would bring tuition really far down, right? You still have your people to pay, but it would also enable you to really invest in your people. That's again another thing, right? A building, living on a college campus and in a college community, a traditional brick and mortar college community for a decade. A water main breaks, and you've got to spend enormous amounts of money doing that. And it doesn't matter. You can't afford now to give raises to your staff. That's how it works. So wouldn't it be cooler? You'd actually be able to take better care of your people when your staff and faculty are your only your only serious expense. It's not like you don't have any fixed costs, but it's so much less. And so you can make that the priority, and you can keep tuition low for students, and you can deliver this amazing interface. You can deliver these amazing classes, which are unlike anything that had really been in online education before. So, now all of a sudden seeing this, I was like, wow, this should happen. This is a thing that really needs to happen. And I kind of waited a bit, and I'm like, nobody's doing this. And so I was like, okay, I guess we'll do this, because this is, it became a kind of a calling, that I'm like, I've been made aware of this possibility. Like, I see this really clearly. Nobody else seems to see it, so I'm going to take the leap and do it. And in the end, I do think Signum is really small. We have one tiny little master's degree program in a very niche subject, right? We have a master's degree program in Tolkien studies, imaginative literature, Germanic philology, medieval and Renaissance literature. That's all we do. And obviously, that's not a very broad appeal, right? But that's never been our intention to have a super broad appeal. But what we are, though we're tiny, we are a little glimpse. We are a little case study, right? This is the 21st century university. This is what the future of higher education looks like. I genuinely believe that. I don't think that the current tuition rates and the current trajectories of things, it's not sustainable. It's not sustainable for people. People can't be continued to ask to do this. Student debt is an issue I'm very passionate about. And I can't, I hear other people who talk about this now, like Bernie Sanders, for instance. I love Bernie, but I can't agree with him here. I mean, I certainly do agree with him when he will stand up and say that the student debt issue is unsustainable. His solution is, so let's make state education free tuition for everybody. In other words, let's just have the taxpayers pay for it. That's not sustainable either, Bernie. Come on. That's just kicking the can. That's not solving the problem. This is actually a solution to the problem. This is a new model for education, which I think preserves everything that is best about the teaching model. It's not the same experience, obviously. No one's going to pretend that, studying at an institution like Signum is the same thing as living at a 4-year residential college. It's not the same thing. But you can get a wonderful education there, and you can emerge without being in hideous debt. So again, right now, we are existing as, we're not taking over the world, but we are we're setting out to be sort of an example, to be a demonstration to say this works, and we can approach this whole thing differently. We can treat people better. We can, we can not be, bilking our students. We cannot be exploiting our faculty and staff. We can be trying to do everything, just kind of step back and rethink a lot of stuff about higher education and adopt a new model and move forward in a digitally native way. We are completely completely native, completely digital, it's actually a really funny part of this whole review process because, you're constantly talking to people who have been operating their whole lives within a 20th century higher education paradigm. And there's so many things that they just they don't understand because we're just different. Like, for instance, the record keeping, right? Like the questions asked about record keeping are things like, do you keep your student records in a fireproof, lockable environment? And I'm like, that's
yes.
cute. You don't
I think.
Yeah, exactly. It will definitely not catch fire. I promise. And we don't keep anything in paper. I can still hold in one hand every single scrap of paper, every single paper record that Signum has, like everything, our entire university, everything in paper. Because we don't, I mean, why would we do that? We don't do any of that. We are completely, our campus is totally the campus in the cloud, And again, but there's so many assumptions that people make that it's just different, and I get that. It's kind of fun, though it's challenging sometimes being new.
Can you tell people about the free programs that Signum offers to the public? Because I think this is very important.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's always been a really core part of what we do as well. We have our master's degree program, which of course we try to keep as low tuition as possible, but it is tuition bearing. But also we are equally committed to open public programming, essentially continuing the sort of spirit of the work that I was doing with my podcast originally. So the Mythgard Institute is what is sort of at the heart of this. And that's sort of the heart of our open public programming. And that's essentially where most of my podcast material now lives, in partnership with the Mythgard Institute. I'm still doing a lot of the, many teaching programs that have grown out of the stuff that I always did with my podcast. The central ones being the Exploring the Lord of the Rings, course, project, massive undertaking, whatever you want to call it.
It's basically the most extremely close reading of Lord of the Rings you can imagine.
It is.
Will go on indefinitely. There's no time limit.
It is the theoretically closest you can get. We're literally reading through and discussing the Lord of the Rings sentence by sentence and paragraph by paragraph, skipping nothing, which is not even actually what I started doing at the beginning, but I got into that by the time I was halfway through chapter 2. Yeah, and it's been great. I'm now in the middle of the most in-depth reading of the Lord of the Rings I will ever do in my entire life, and I love it. We just finished session number 71. Sessions are an hour and a half to 2 hours long. We've done 71 sessions, and we're not quite to the attack on Weathertop. We're about 2/3 of the way through chapter 11 of the Fellowship of the Ring.
I've been listening.
Yeah, but it's great fun. Anyway, so that's one example of our programs. Also, my Silmarillion film project, which is a lot of fun, where we're going through and we are planning out a completely theoretical film adaptation of the Silmarillion. A sort of sequential serial production. Basically, Amazon is following in our footsteps. Basically, we've been doing this for 4 years now, and Amazon obviously must listen to our podcast and decided that was an awesome idea. I'm still waiting for my phone call from Amazon, by the way. But anyway, so that's another thing that we do, which is really fun. I also have been doing some programs in partnership with the Lord of the Rings Online video game. The Lord of the Rings Online is such a brilliant adaptation of Tolkien. The developers of that game are such careful, thoughtful readers of Tolkien, and I love the stuff that they have done with the narrative of that game, with the layout of the world of that game. It's so interesting. So I've spent a lot of time streaming. So I stream on Twitch now, which is sort of a new thing for me. But I've been sort of playing my way through the game and looking at the relationship between the story and their interpretation and adaptation of the story in the game. Really, really fascinating stuff. There are some new programs. I can't give too many details now because we're still working out some of the details. In this next year or two, the Mythgard Institute, it's still mostly been a lot of just me teaching stuff. We have some other features and some other special seminars and things at times. But anyway, we in the next year or two, our primary focus is going to be expanding outwards. We would really love to be able to engage with other groups. I mean, we do a lot with Tolkien fans and a lot for Tolkien fans. And, there are a lot of other groups of people who would love to talk about more stuff, to do more like the kind of Tolkien stuff that we do. So we have some plans to expand and do some new programs, which is going to be really exciting.
And you've got Mythgard Academy, which is a seminar series, online seminar series.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's run by, so we have, so much of Signum University is able to be done because of the support of our listeners. We don't, none of the Mythgard stuff we charge for, just like my podcast, it's all available out there for free. We do have our annual fundraising campaign in order to help keep Signum alive, which is, to which people have responded very, very generously over the years. And one of the kind of reward structures we have for that is, all of the people who donate to support our institution get to vote on what books we do. So the Mythgard Academy is like this long-term book club where, I'll do a class, a close reading on different books based on what the people, our supporters, vote for. Now, of course, there are a lot of Tolkien fans, so we do a lot of Tolkien. And in fact, we've been spending now the last several years doing a close reading, marching all the way through the History of Middle-earth series, which is Christopher Tolkien's editions of all of the early drafts and early, like the fairy stories Tolkien wrote, his very, very first Silmarillion stories he started writing, when he was like 20, some of the things that he started writing in the trenches in World War I, all the way through. We just completed, or have almost completed the first 3 volumes of the History of the Lord of the Rings, looking at the whole the manuscript development of the Lord of the Rings story. So we're going to be moving on with that. But in the meantime, we are interrupting that because we have one rule, which is that every other book we can't do any 2 books in a row by the same author, which is basically to prevent it from being nothing but a Tolkien discussion. So every other book we do is a non-Tolkien book in practice. And we've done a lot of really fun books that way, some of which I had never even read before. But the book that we're doing...
So you've done Dracula, you did Boethius's The Consolation of Philosophy.
Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, that was huge. Yeah.
And now you're doing Le Morte d'Arthur by Sir Thomas Malory.
Absolutely, yeah. Which is it's just going to be a pretty big project. We just had class number 6 last night. We're still in the first section. We didn't quite get to the marriage of Arthur and Guinevere last time. So
yeah, I've been listening along to the past few books that you've done, but with this one, I realized, okay, I can't commit to this now, so I'm just going to have to read it some other time.
Well, that's great. And of course, all of our stuff is available. I do the class sessions synchronously for Mythgard Academy, for all of them, Exploring the Lord of the Rings, Mythgard Academy, all of those things. But all of them are also available after the fact. You can get audio recordings of all of these classes either on my Tolkien Professor podcast feed or on our Mythgard Academy podcast feed. And we also have all of the video recordings up on our YouTube channel. So if you just look for Signum University on YouTube, you'll find all of the hundreds and hundreds of hours of classes there. So you can go through the books that we've already done in the Mythgard Academy and, watch those and go through those at any time.
All right. I kind of thought we would get through the Signum stuff in a half hour, so there's not that much time left for...
That's all right. I can stay a little bit longer if you want a little bit more time.
Okay. So first, I've been wondering about, I've observed your approach of reading and teaching to sort of a general adult audience, but you have kids and you presumably read Tolkien with your kids. I'm sort of curious, are you familiar with Tolkien's letter where he sort of says something along the lines of he thinks the age of 10 or so is a bit too early to read Lord of the Rings? Yeah.
No, this question of when to read the Lord of the Rings with kids is a tricky one.
Yeah. So what's your view on that?
It really depends on the kid. The fact is, the Lord of the Rings is just harder from a prose style standpoint, and but the thing is, I find that I can't establish a rule. I've met lots of people who read and loved the Lord of the Rings, especially with their parents at a very early age, like, 8 or 9 or something like that. And, that happens, and that's, my goodness, I was surprised in a delightful conversation with an 11-year-old who had not only read The Lord of the Rings, but had read The Silmarillion and the Book of Lost Tales and had incredibly sophisticated questions about this adorable little 11-year-old girl who was small for her age, so she comes up to me and sort of tugs on my sleeve and says she has a question about Tolkien. I'm like, oh yeah, sure. What is it? And her question was, In the Book of Lost Tales, it says that Gothmog is Melkor's son. What's up with that? And I was like, whoa. Okay. Wow. That's not cool. The question I was expecting. So anyway, but like I said, there are some kids who are ready for it and who really just love it. And there are others who really aren't. And as when you're a parent who loves Tolkien, it can be really difficult, right? Because, it's, you want to share this with your kid and, sometimes they can I would just be really sensitive to, what your kids are able to handle. And it's not like how smart is your kid kind of thing. It's really about, I don't know, kind of the way their minds and imagination works, I think, more than anything else. And Tolkien's prose style is different. He spends a lot of time doing like landscape descriptions and things. If your kid is not, Tolkien was very visual. He was a painter, and you can tell from his prose that he spent a lot of time visually imagining these scenes in his mind and spends a lot of time describing them. To people who are not like that, those sections are just boring and even puzzling. Like, why are we still talking about the trees? I don't understand. Why do we care? Why isn't anything happening? Why isn't somebody talking? It's so,
I didn't become a big Tolkien fan until I was in college. My dad read the books to me when I was a kid, and I liked them. But then when I tried to read Lord of the Rings on my own for the first time in high school, I got stuck in the Two Towers because I'm not a visual person, and it took me a while to be able to appreciate descriptive writing. But I actually gave up in the middle of the Two Towers when I was like 16 or something, because I just couldn't get into the long journey descriptive type passages.
In a lot of ways, it's not for everyone. I mean, I think that Tolkien is for everyone, but the different people will kind of approach. There are some people who will never really love it, and like that's fine. And it's not about. And I know with parents especially, they often just think of it as a like it's about like how smart your kid is, right? Like, oh, my kid is really smart. He'll definitely be able to read The Lord of the Rings at a young age. It's like, well, it's not. That's not really it. It's not really about, it's not an intelligence screen. It's, as I say, more about how their minds and how their imagination works. Some kids will really respond to it and some won't. So what I would recommend is, if the kid shows interest in it, then start reading it. If you see the kid fading, I mean, if they're wandering off, if it's hard to keep their attention on the book, don't force it, I would say. And just kind of let it go. I've been especially gentle, almost to the point of diffidence, actually, because it's hard. My kids have grown up. I mean, I started my podcast when my oldest son was 4 and my youngest was not yet conceived. And, now my sons are 15 and 10. And so they've grown up in the world in which like daddy is the Tolkien professor is like as normal, as like daddy is a stockbroker, So Tolkien has always been kind of like the family business in my house. And so I've always been very careful not to try to force it on them because it could be something that they could sort of rebel against on principle. Daddy likes this and so I don't, and I never wanted to. So I've been very, very careful to let them always initiate and go through only when they want and not at my own insistence. Yeah, my younger son has not read The Lord of the Rings, but we will. We're going to be listening to the audiobook version of The Lord of the Rings this year in our trips to and from school. I drive them both to school in the mornings. So we're gonna start listening to The Lord of the Rings this year, and so that'll be his first time. My older son has read it, though I actually don't think he finished it. I think he stopped in the middle of the Two Towers too. So it'll be his first time all the way through.
So my other question about that was your approach to reading and teaching these texts is very text focused. I mean, you're basically just trying to read as carefully as possible and not. You are not really an archetype, you don't really talk about that sort of thing, archetypes and themes. I mean, you do talk about themes, but at a very close level to the text. Right. So I'm just sort of curious if when reading these things with your kids, you were any more moralistic? Like, did you use them as a vehicle for moral instruction at all?
Yes, though usually after the fact. Rarely when we're going through it, do I sort of try to draw clear lessons from that. Where it comes in is in application later. When something else is happening, right? When we are having a moral discussion for some other externally driven reason, right? Because of something else that is going on, then I'll go back to Tolkien, right? To sort of illustrate, some of the things to me, that is, Tolkien is just massively applicable. You can see Tolkien's work, even Tolkien himself did it, right? You can see in Christopher and Tolkien, and J.R.R. Tolkien's letters to Christopher during World War II, right? Both of them used the language, even when The Lord of the Rings wasn't finished being written yet. They were already using the vocabulary of The Lord of the Rings, to talk about the war and everything. And that's, that kind of thing. It is that more than anything else. Again, Tolkien, poet, not teacher, right? So he's not going to. I would have a much harder time not moralizing about Narnia, frankly, right? Sort of talking directly about Aslan, Aslan as Jesus, and the very direct parallels and the very direct lessons that we can learn, and so many beautiful things that
because that's the spirit in which it was captured. Written.
Absolutely. So for instance, if I'm reading The Horse and His Boy with my son, and we're, at the place where Aslan is walking with Shasta up the pass towards Narnia, right? And that wonderful speech, one of my favorite moments in the whole Chronicles of Narnia, the I was the lion speech that Aslan gives. I would have a very hard time not stopping and now let's have a conversation about God, But listening to Tolkien, reading Tolkien with my kids, I very rarely do that. But again, later on, now they're facing some kind of, moral or spiritual challenge of their own in some other way. That's when I will talk about Tolkien, right? Because it is such a wonderfully applicable myth to life in so many ways.
All right, that was part 1 of my interview with the Tolkien Professor, and part 2 with the big ol' Tolkien Q&A will go out next week. You can find links to Signum University and various other related resources on the show notes page at catholicculture.org/episode 15. Today's reading is from a letter from Tolkien to his son Michael. This is letter 250 in the collected letters of Tolkien, on the topic of scandals in the church. You speak of sagging faith. However, that is quite another matter. In the last resort, faith is an act of will, inspired by love. Our love may be chilled and our will eroded by the spectacle of the shortcomings, folly, and even sins of the church and its ministers, but I do not think that one who has once had faith goes back over the line for these reasons, least of all anyone with any historical knowledge. Scandal at most is an occasion of temptation, as indecency is to lust, which it does not make but arouses. It is convenient because it tends to turn our eyes away from ourselves and our own faults to find a scapegoat. But the act of will of faith is not a single moment of final decision. It is a permanent, indefinitely repeated act and state which must go on. So we pray for final perseverance. The temptation to unbelief, which really means rejection of our Lord and his claims, is always there within us. Part of us longs to find an excuse for it outside us. The stronger the inner temptation, the more readily and severely shall we be scandalized by others. I think I am as sensitive as you or any other Christian to the scandals, both of clergy and laity. I have suffered grievously in my life from stupid, tired, dimmed, and even bad priests, but I now know enough about myself to be aware that I should not leave the church, which for me would mean leaving the allegiance of our Lord, for any such reasons. I should leave because I did not believe, and should not believe any more, even if I had never met anyone in orders who was not both wise and saintly. I should deny the blessed sacrament, that is, call our Lord a fraud to his face. If he is a fraud and the gospel's fraudulent, that is, garbled accounts of a demented megalomaniac, which is the only alternative, then of course the spectacle exhibited by the church, in the sense of clergy, in history and today, is simply evidence of a gigantic fraud. If not, however, then this spectacle is, alas, only what was to be expected. It began before the first Easter, and it does not affect faith at all, except that we may and should be deeply grieved. But we should grieve on our Lord's behalf and for him, associating ourselves with the scandalizers, not with the saints, not crying out that we cannot take Judas Iscariot, or even the absurd and cowardly Simon Peter, or the silly women like James's mother, trying to push her sons. It takes a fantastic will to unbelief to suppose that Jesus never really happened, and more to suppose that he did not say the things recorded of him, so incapable of being invented by anyone in the world at that time, such as, before Abraham came to be, I am. He that hath seen me hath seen the Father, or the promulgation of the Blessed Sacrament in John 5. He that eateth my flesh and drinketh my blood hath eternal life. We must therefore either believe in him and in what he said and take the consequences, or reject him and take the consequences. I find it for myself difficult to believe that anyone who has ever been to communion, even once, with at least a right intention, can ever again reject him without grave blame. However, he alone knows each unique soul and its circumstances. The only cure for sagging of fainting faith is communion. Though always itself perfect and complete and inviolate, the Blessed Sacrament does not operate completely and once for all in any of us. Like the act of faith, it must be continuous and grow by exercise. Frequency is of the highest effect. 7 times a week is more nourishing than 7 times at intervals. Okay, there's quite a bit more to that, but I'll leave it at that. I hope that helps. Jesus promised always to be faithful to his church. And the worst thing about the scandals in the church is that they hurt him. So let's try to console him rather than hurting him even more by abandoning him.